the time horizon you give yourself for something like this, right? Social re-engineering sounds like a much harder thing to do than, say, competing on price or just giving consumers an option where they click a button and do something different.
I'm a sucker for pain. This is another.
I was being polite.
Something like this, won't happen in like a 2 to 4 year time frame. I think start sooner. You have one life, give it everything, right? And don't hold back. It is the most fulfilling thing you will do as an entrepreneur.
Today, we're going to be talking to Dhruv Sawhney, the former founder of WOTU, the company that Zomato acquired and rebranded as Hyperpure. In this video, we'll be talking to Dhruv about his experience pivoting out of software and running a distribution cum agri-tech business. We'll get his perspective on opportunities available to entrepreneurs looking at serving MSMEs in India and also explore building for the agri-tech space. Hey Dhruv, welcome to Weekend Entrepreneurs.
Hey, first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. Super excited to be here with you guys. And yes, and also thanks for aging me. I am one of the more senior entrepreneurs on the circuit, I guess, but that also brings some advantages, I would like to believe. No, I think I've probably been part of one of the early waves of what was the startup ecosystem starting to come together in Bangalore and India overall. I moved back to India in 2012, which was on the back of my stint with PayPal in Ireland. I spent about 7.5 years with PayPal in various leadership roles, heading product and operations and a lot of their operational excellence across the globe. So set up in Bangalore back in 2012. Moved here to establish a R&D center for about 400 engineers and was also reconfiguring how PayPal was executing on different, kind of capabilities that they were building through tech across the globe. So that was an exciting period, and that also kind of gave me an exposure to, what was happening in the Indian ecosystem. And very quickly, I was starting to build an understanding that there's many problems and many opportunities therefore that needed to be solved. And I was pretty kicked and excited largely by the B2B ecosystem that was largely absent back then. That's what kind of got me thinking about WOTU and the opportunities there.
Yeah. So could you describe a little bit more about what WOTU did and the specific problems that you were looking to solve? I think our audience would love to hear that.
Yeah, I think what was very evident very early on, I'm talking 2014, 2015, was that, you had, websites, not even apps like IndiaMart, where, they were trying to organize information and discovery. There was no transactional capabilities for different sectors. B2B was largely an ignored area at that point. I think you had traditional businesses in the B2B space, and then you had a very large segment of the industry which was unorganized. So the idea of WOTU was to create a marketplace of marketplaces. Even the name was a bit corny. It kind of meant we organize the unorganized. And so the idea was to go after kind of more fundamental commodity marketplaces like food, paper, flowers, different manufacturing segments. And if you actually look around today, there's probably 100 different successful startups today that are doing that quite effectively. And so when I dove into setting this up, the first sector that I went after was food, because I thought it's ubiquitous, it's everyday. B2B, Horeca seems to be a good logical focus area because, there's more predictable demand. And so it should be easier to build an organized supply chain by having a predictable demand engine. So that was the initial thinking. The idea was to then diversify into other categories. That never happened. This just became an all-consuming category in itself.
Could you put us in your shoes when you were making that transition from PayPal to WOTU, right? Because I imagine working at PayPal, you were probably dealing with a different set of considerations, probably working with tech teams. And this feels more like looking at SMBs in India seems like a different paradigm. So how does one make that transition? Was it a top-down analysis? Was it something that struck you? Was it intentional? You looking to make sense of what are the opportunities in the India space?
Yeah. I think there were two factors. I think even before moving to India, I'd always been interested in the B2B sector. I'd always been looking at more predictable business problems that needed to be solved. And also, if you rewind back another 10 years, the advent of the internet and web-based transactions, they were largely focused on solving consumer problems, information discovery problems. And then slowly when Amazon came about, these were all early stage e-commerce startups back then. And so there still was, people still hadn't kind of shifted the mindset into the B2B space. So for me, that was always a white space that needed to be explored. I was pretty kicked about it. And so when I moved to India, automatically, there were a lot of conversations about, farmer suicides, farmers are dumping their produce. There's not enough predictability in terms of supply and demand. And therefore that major disconnect is, leading to, a lot of fundamental issues. So that really got me interested. That was a real world problem. It was a B2B problem. And so that kind of drew me into the space. And then when I started thinking more about it, there was a very clear, very large opportunity that needed, to be solved. So that's what kind of brought me into this space.
Understood. Yeah, but if I may, just very tactically, right? So the reason we're called Weekend Entrepreneurs is, I don't know if it's partly inspiration, partly, I guess, a jibe at all of us who talk about problems in the weekend, but never really do anything about it because we do it more armchair. What you just described, which is I saw something in the news, something that I observed at a high level, the jump from there to the super tactical specifics. All right, what do I do? What is step number one? Curious about how you did the groundwork. Did you hit up folks in your network? Did you go to meet your future customers on the ground? How do you take that step?
Yeah, I think there was, and even if I step back before that, there was some other context as well, right? Like PayPal was supposed to launch its product in India. This is, around about the time that, Paytm also was kind of early stages, hadn't really created a strong consumer platform. And so for me, the initial excitement was that maybe PayPal is going to launch in India and I'll get to play a role on that. That just kept deferring year on year. So to answer your question specifically, tactically, what gave me the headroom to do that was the fact that I was waiting for something bigger to happen in my day job, which just never happened. So that just, pushed me into looking for alternative things to be creative. And then that's what kind of led me to starting to talk to people. I kind of hit up a few people in my network in India, started talking to entrepreneurs who had kind of built stuff up on the ground already. Did, go and speak to a few restaurant partners and really did some, primary research there. And it was very clear that this is a real opportunity. For example, a standalone restaurant, medium size, maybe 40 to 60 seater cover table would, be sourcing from 20 to 30 different vendors, right? And if you actually stood in their back door on how deliveries were happening, they were all coming in like gunny bags, plastic bags, like you would not bother ordering from any of those restaurants or dining in if you actually saw how food was delivered. And, I'd also seen this movie, I think it was called The 100-Foot Journey or something, where there's a family from India that moves to France. They start sourcing from local French farmers markets and build this really beautiful dining experience. And for me, it was like, that's the inspiration. That should happen for every restaurant, and there should be local sourcing, local produce, reliable quality, fresh produce available for everyone, right? So I think the more I got into it, the more I got inspired. And I think my advice to any entrepreneur would be you really need to first zero in on the problem you're most passionate about. And if it's something that's going to compel you to spend enough time, not just on the weekend, but every available free opportunity, you kind of know you're onto something, right? And then just follow your heart.
Right. Was there a moment though when you felt like it was it that the evidence of what could it be was sufficient enough to drag you outside of your job, or was there a moment? How does one get to that I quit, I'm going to do something else moment, I guess? Because a lot of us are on the precipice and never go there.
That's like $1 million question, right? Or a few $1 million questions, right? For a lot of people, and myself included, I think it's contextual to everybody, right? So you may have some personal compelling needs, some family needs and commitments. I wouldn't advise that you completely ignore them and take a leap of faith. I think That's definitely something to factor in. But equally, don't do it because you're just frustrated out of a certain job and you think, launching your own startup is the next best solution. If you think putting up with a bad boss is tough, you don't know what's coming your way when you launch your own startup, right? So it's nothing but a journey of a lot of self-doubt, a lot of self-inflicted pain, and really being able to get back on your feet every day and putting in your blood, sweat, and tears, not knowing what the outcome is going to be. So that's the hard reality. It's not the glory of the fundraisers and all the things we read about. But it is one of the most gratifying journeys you will make. For me personally, I think it was a combination of, I felt I was at a point in my life where I could take some risks. Not that I was financially done or secure, but I was at a point that if I don't do it now, I'm never ever going to be able to do it. And that was, I'm like 49 now. I was coming close to 40 back then, so about 10 years ago. And if I didn't do it around then, it would just, I wouldn't have the energy or the will to do it any later, right? So for me, it was like, it's here or now. And then it was also a factor of, PayPal kept deferring what it had to do in India year on year. So that was like enough reason for me to make a move on. I'd done enough research on, believing there was a real opportunity at hand, and then really just going for it, right? So my co-founder there was Mihir. He and I, he was also in PayPal. So over a few drinks over, one Christmas break, we both decided to do this, and we said, okay, once we're sober and we're done with the New Year's shenanigans, if we both come back and still agree to do it, we'll do it. So that was, we came back and we agreed to do it still in while we were sober, and then we just went on.
I was going to say, note to listeners, though, once you're sober is the operative bit there.
Yes, yes. And that also came on the back of, some fair weather warning from one of my dearest friends, Manish. He's the founder for Printo. And, he had visited me at PayPal, and he was like, look, you've got a good gig going here. Why, think long, think hard, right? I think you're having a moment of, momentary lapse of reasoning. And so I think all your friends, your advisors will caution you, advise you. If you still feel strongly enough is when you're ready to go.
A bunch of questions here and a lot of things I'd love to dig into. What did you learn while selling to MSMEs in India, right? Most of the companies I'm assuming that you were selling to via WOTU were broadly MSMEs, right? So I'm curious to know what you sort of learned about the overall go-to-market motion, selling to that audience.
Yeah, I think, and this has gone back almost, 9-10 years, right? And at that point, there weren't very strong, kind of credit scoring mechanisms available. This was a highly unorganized sector. Digital penetration was still early in especially the small, medium enterprises. A lot of these were like small sized restaurants, privately run restaurants, not necessarily large chains even. I'd say 80% of the target market was that kind of persona. And so building for, an unorganized sector, MSMEs was significantly challenging back then. And so you really had to rely on building some of the ground up, what I would call plumbing and decision-making systems on how to drive behaviors, how to get better judge of offering credit to MSMEs and things like that. And there wasn't a lot of ecosystem support for building a B2B business focused on the unorganized MSME market segment back then. So you really have to do a lot of that heavy lifting yourself. And a lot of it, unfortunately, comes on, trial and error, and you kind of build those learnings back into your business. You start developing best practices. You start developing better algorithms, better notions of what needs to be done. One of the biggest challenges back then was the entire industry was used to ordering, in the night, and how do you still provide them that same level of flexibility while making sure that we have the supply chain to deliver to, hundreds and thousands of restaurants, while keeping the wastage in the supply chain as low as possible, right? Because that impacts profitability. B2B margins are slim, and but the scales are higher. And so how do you minimize supply chain loss and wastage while keeping the same efficiency? So there were a number of fundamental problems. How do you solve for credit? How do you solve for supply chain and wastage? How do you drive digital adoption? These kinds of challenges are far easier today because MSMEs are used to. There are multiple platforms already built that they're accustomed to using. None of this existed 10 years ago. And so I think that those were some of the early challenges that I had to grapple with.
Yeah, no, totally. And jumping ahead a little bit, you ended up selling the business to Zomato, and that business got rebranded as Hyperpure. And Zomato's had a bunch of acquisitions over the years, but I feel like this and probably Blinkit and to some extent Runner are the ones that I feel like really worked out, right? So while we actually talk about the journey at Zomato, I'm curious to know, how did you almost know that it was time to sell? What led you to that decision, and why to Zomato? Because at least based on news reports, it felt like there were other players who were also interested in buying WOTU, like Swiggy and so on. So I'm curious to know your thought process over there.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bittersweet opportunity for me. I think the timing for the Zomato acquisition was very opportune for the business, right? To be fair, it didn't necessarily give me the returns that I would have expected, but it gave me immense satisfaction that the business found a great home and had the right partnership to actually scale and grow. And that was my larger interest. We had done kind of a seed and a pre-Series A. K Capital had supported the initial launch. We had Mumbai Angels backing us as well. But then, we were looking at raising some debt, and then the next round. Back then, there wasn't a lot of support for, B2B businesses that required CapEx, because we were building a cold storage supply chain. And so those weren't in fashion back in 2015, 2016. And today the thing is flipped. B2B businesses are seen as being more predictable, more reliable. You're creating some differentiation. You're creating some hard assets and value, which are inherently seen as a plus. And so when the opportunity came along, it was literally we were in conversation with Swiggy for probably 6 weeks, 7 weeks, and got a call from the Zomato team. I flew down, met Dipinder, and we instantly clicked. There was clear understanding at both ends on the value that WOTU could add to Zomato. There was great synergies, which I knew all along, and so for me the decision was pretty easy. I knew that Zomato would be a great partner, and it would be great to see this business scale. So within, I think, I'd say a couple of weeks, we pulled the trigger and made that call. And I think that's worked out wonderfully well, both for Zomato, for me, given all the situation that we were in, and most excitingly for the business today. I think Hyperpure is definitely one of the growth engines for Zomato. I think it's doing maybe 35-40 million a month, something like that. It's in 10 cities.
Yeah.
It's probably one of the largest organized B2B food platforms in India.
At least based on the last earnings report, Hyperpure was making 617 crores as of then annually. And it was like, it's growing by 50% year on year. So definitely a very, very sizable business.
And there was one additional insight which was pretty useful, right? And I think that's another way that entrepreneurs should should look at when you're coming to looking for exit. So you're looking at what could be a future exit for your business, right? In the case of Hyperpure or WOTU, by providing ingredients, we're targeting 100% of the share of wallet for any restaurant, right? And that typically is about 1/3 of their revenue. So if a restaurant is doing 100 rupees in billing, then they're spending about 35 rupees on inputs in terms of ingredients and packaging, potentially a little bit more. And so that is the available opportunity compared to, the delivery business, which is, let's say for argument's sake, 50-50 between Swiggy and Zomato. And then, you're probably getting only on another 50%, which is, just on deliveries. So you're down to 25% of the 100 rupees. And then off that, you're probably getting maybe a 20-25%, margin or commission. So you're down to single digits, 7-8%. So at best, or maybe even lower, 6%, right? So 6% compared to 33%. So in terms of, opportunity, Hyperpure's right up there. So my belief is, as Hyperpure continues to scale and deliver value, at some point it could supersede the delivery business. And I think that was also echoed recently by the Zomato board.
Yeah. No, I read that in the earnings report as well. Hyperpure, the fact that Hyperpure exists within Zomato, it sort of brought the DNA within the company around B2B supply chain management and how to actually do B2B procurement, which is very important for Blinkit, right? So
yeah.
Clearly,
there's a lot of synergies there.
Yeah, definitely. What would you say is the ideal customer profile, like the market segment for Hyperpure? Were it the small restaurants on the side of the road? Were they like the independent restaurants like Hole in the Wall Cafe in Bangalore? Or were they like the Zen at the Leela's? Who are the buyers, right? Who used Hyperpure?
Yeah. I'll give you an interesting story and an insight which will answer your question, right? So I think when we started building WOTU and scaling Hyperpure, the initial thought process was every product, every service needs a hook, right? And the hook that was very clear in the very early days of WOTU was that this business is going to be built around protein supply, which is, if you look at the entire protein supply chain, primarily around chicken in India, most of the organized, high quality, hygienic chicken supply was coming from large scale processors and being delivered directly to the large hotel chains and caterers, right? There wasn't a clear supply chain flow from those large processors through to these small, medium restaurants, the 30, 40, 50-seater restaurants. And most of those guys were having to go to a metro cash and carry, or they had to go to the local butcher or somebody else they knew who would, organize it for them. The pricing was inconsistent, quality was inconsistent, availability was inconsistent. And so they had multiple challenges. And protein typically accounts for like maybe 40% of your cost base, 30 to 40% of your cost base, right? And so if you can get that right, you kind of have access then to the whole basket. You can start building around that. So that became pretty evident. And so what we tried to do at WOTU in the very early days was solve for that. And so while it was a great insight, it wasn't an easy one to solve for, because it's, no pun intended, like a chicken and an egg story. For me to build a strong chicken supply, I need a strong demand. And I can't be affording that as a startup, because the organized suppliers would not, give me a low volume supply in the early days. So this was something that had to be solved, which was a pretty interesting case on its own for any startup entrepreneur. And I'm sure that in most supply chain led businesses in the B2B space, this is a very common problem. The only difference is the shelf life here was literally like 2 days, right? And so dealing with fresh, antibiotic, residue-free chicken, which is high quality, consistently available, you have predictable supply chains in place, not easy to solve for. But once we did, that was it. that's when we saw major traction. So our initial target segments were not the large hotel chains, but they were actually, we were filling a service gap that really was a clear opportunity. And from there, we started kind of building the business up. Then we also went to the larger chains as our volumes grew, our strength grew. We became it's a service that I think works for pretty much everybody.
Got it. Could you talk a bit more about what your actual GTM motion was? What was your actual, how did you actually get your customers? In the initial days, I imagine you might have done door-to-door sales. I'm just guessing here, and then
100%.
Right.
Walk in, door-to-door sales, stepped in there, spoke to the owners, spoke to the procurement guys, and very quickly you start realizing what works. And unless you've done a few hundred of these, you really don't know your customer, right? And actually, there is, whatever people may say, B2B doesn't work till you've built relationships. And so, one key learning for me was your go-to-market is first to build relationships. On the back of that, deliver a stellar service, build a reputation, and then you can have other go-to-market strategies in operation, right? And I think that's true. Like if you look at any successful business, whether it's in the airline service or any service industry, reputation is everything, and it takes time to build reputation. There's no like you can't throw marketing money behind reputation. And in the startup ecosystem, sometimes entrepreneurs feel and investors feel that we can grow fast, we can throw money at a problem and solve it. Actually, my strongest advice would be never to do that in a B2B space, because money actually changes behaviors and sets the wrong behavior indicators for B2B buyers. So if you think you can scale by discounting in the early days, you'll actually send the wrong signals. You will bring in buyers only when there are discounts, and your true value of the service will never get discovered. And so the go-to-market has to be built on quality, pricing competitiveness, and a consistent supply chain. Once that is in place, you build a reputation, and then you actually on the right to kind of scale and grow. Then it kind of snowballs on its own.
If in a hypothetical world where new competitors come in and there are more competitors, you talked a lot about reputation. Do you think that's what keeps these businesses, keeps the incumbent businesses protected against your newer competitors who may raise a lot of capital and try to go after the same customers?
B2B is a space where building a competitor is going to be much harder unless you have a differentiated service, right? It's been a few years that Hyperpure has been up and running. WOTU Hyperpure has been running. There isn't a second Hyperpure out there still, right? I've personally been contacted by at least a dozen startup founders, and I've offered help and support to build a competitor. My only question to them has been, tell me how you're going to create a differentiated service. Come up with something that Hyperpure won't do. That doesn't mean that there isn't an opportunity for a second Hyperpure. It just means you have to think harder, think longer, and then once you've identified what is the differentiator, then you can go after it.
Makes sense. Okay, so if I may push you on that, let's say you really had gun to head, had to start a competitor here, right? Knowing what you know, what you talked about a differentiated service. Tactically, what do you think? What do you think someone could do?
So I'll give you another interesting insight on what I did in the early days of WOTU. Yeah. And probably the early days of Hyperpure. I don't think that's continuing. So, and I still believe that's a strong differentiation. I think that, right now Hyperpure is running more as a cookie cutter. Here's a marketplace of everything. You can kind of build out what you want. And I think some of the phenomenal things that are happening is that they're going deeper back into the, more upstream into the supply chain, building their own, the greenhouses and everything else. So all your leafy greens, all of that comes fresh, predictable supplies and demand engine. So all of that is good. In the early days of WOTU, I had actually hired a chef, one of the leading chefs. He had worked in top restaurants in London. He was working at a top hotel in Bangalore. And I'd actually gone to pitch to him. And when he heard about the service that we were looking to offer, he was so excited. He said, "Hey, Dhruv, I'd love to come work with you," right? And that was great. So we actually brought him on board, and he was head of quality for us, and also assisting in sales. And so my best sales happened when he would go and speak to other chefs and talk about the possibilities of curating some amazing menus. For example, if somebody didn't have a seafood platter or any seafood on their menu, he could jive with that other chef and say, "Hey, you could do this, you could get these prawns, you could do this, and you could put a nice platter out for like $1,500. You'd have like a 60% margin on that," and so on and so forth. And they would all get really excited, like, "Oh wow, I didn't even think about this. And so do you have this, and do you have this?" So it went from me being a vendor to me being a partner, right? And suddenly we would bring those top chefs into our warehouses, and it was like, Candyland for them. It was like Disneyland for them. They're like, "Oh, I didn't know you could get this. I didn't know you could get that. Hey, can you also source this for me?" And I think that's the beauty of building an amazing business like this in the B2B space, where you actually offer some exclusive services. You kind of go deeper, you partner deeper with a lot of these restaurants. I may be wrong, but I think just the scale and how Hyperpure is operating today, some of that is probably lost. And I still feel that can be a very strong differentiator if done systematically in a more targeted way.
Almost taking a community-led approach on the GTM side was actually could actually be very interesting over here. And I haven't heard of anyone doing something similar. And I was looking at different competitors and so on and so forth as well. So, but yeah, go ahead.
I guess a startup can have that advantage, which is they can make it more bespoke, they can make it more personal. But do you think scale necessarily makes things impersonal? Like, is this, I guess, the innovator's dilemma, where when this company becomes big, they'll necessarily fall trap of the same thing? Or do you think there's something more structurally different one can do to keep it going in a way that the next entrant in the market cannot have that extra personal dimension and do something about it?
I mean, I'm a guy who leads, with passion from my heart, right? I would like to believe, I really believe that I think that's the challenge every entrepreneur should undertake. How do you actually differentiate your business? How do you make your customers love your business, not just like your business? And I think that's where the true value gets generated. That's how you build long-lasting, differentiated businesses. And that's where you actually truly earn respect, right? And I think especially, and this is not just true for B2B, I think including in B2C, if you don't have that ability, then you're fundamentally missing the point. Your business exists because you're solving a real world problem. The minute you stop seeing your customer, whether it's a consumer or a business, as somebody who needs your service and is therefore reaching out to you, if you stop seeing their need as their requirement, but just see it as a revenue opportunity, it's starting to be game over for you. So the question is, how much do you standardize versus how much do you remain more customer centric? And I think great organizations do that really well, and they really focus on building processes which are more customer centric. And I think that was also one of my learnings from my time at PayPal. Worked with some great leaders there who really emphasized solving real world problems and being customer centric. And I think I've tried to carry that forward in every business opportunity that I worked on since.
Makes sense. Thanks for sharing that, Dhruv. Makes a lot of sense. And I completely agree with you there. It's something that we at Spotcraft are always thinking about, like, how do we make sure we continue to delight customers even as we scale? And yeah, you're right. The really, really unique companies out there, companies like Amazon, they're known for like really, really good customer support and customer service. So makes total sense. Let's actually jump into the next part of your overall career arc, where you left Zomato and dived deeper into the agri-tech space, both at Nurture.farm and now at Rize.farm. Curious to know, like, what made you do that? What were the sort of opportunities that you saw there to dive into in some ways yet another different space, I guess, and domain.
Yeah. No, I think there was now when I look back, for me this is like one continuous journey. If we were to look at WOTU and Hyperpure, that was more downstream, more transactional, looking at the end of how once food is produced, processed and packaged, how do you move it more efficiently while reducing waste? And I think during my time at building WOTU and Hyperpure, there was enough time spent, some brushes working with farmers and producers on really seeing more upstream challenges and what direct sourcing could really do in terms of unlocking more value for the people higher up in the value chain, especially farmers. And so that had already kind of piqued an interest for me. And so when I got the opportunity, I actually did a very brief stint with Gojek in between. Gojek had reached out. They wanted me to replicate WOTU and Hyperpure across the region. I actually relocated to Jakarta for a brief period. And then, Nurture happened. This was just before the onset of COVID. And, there was an opportunity to set up Nurture.farm from the ground up. It was promoted by UPL, which is one of the crop protection majors. And they were looking at a big focus on, sustainability, helping farmers improve resilience, helping create, better platforms and services that would help improve the livelihood of farmers while improving, how we sustainably grow crops as well. And so that, seemed like a really interesting opportunity. So from, moving food more efficiently to actually going upstream and solving another more challenging problem. So I spent a few months thinking about it and then, took the leap of faith. Had never worked in agriculture before, but had, as I said, spent some time with farmers and sourcing from them. And so I moved back to Bangalore to do that just before COVID, built up Nurture.farm through COVID, partnered with some really, really amazing people through that journey, learned a ton about how agriculture works across India. India is an amazing landscape. It's a tapestry of so many cultures, and which are really strongly reflected in our food habits and how food is grown. And so learned a ton of stuff about, what actually goes into producing food and how little we know about it, right? And what it takes to, get food to the table. And I think that problem became even more clearer through COVID. I think when all of us realized, are we going to get our supplies in place? Around about the same time we were building Nurture. And so it was really interesting to see how people's priorities shift. And actually we were building services that were really focused on helping farmers grow more from less, a lot of farm mechanization, solving for farmer risks around climate, had a big focus on rice cultivation, undertook some very significant initiatives around handling the crop residue, waste that gets burned in the north of India, massive problem. We started solving for that. So really, took a deep dive into a number of crops and how to solve for services that did not exist for farmers, and really built a full stack solution around that.
Dhruv, could you, so everything you're saying is interesting, but as a city boy who's grown up with technology all around me, and I'm sitting here in Bangalore where everything's IT and all my friends work at tech companies, everything you're saying feels geographically adjacent, but almost I wouldn't know the first step of how to enter that world. I understand restaurants. I visit restaurants. I can walk up to one and perhaps ask to speak to the owner. But the rest of India feels like a different world to me. So for folks like me out there, how do you actually make that jump? Are there points in your network that got you there? Was it your prior job that perhaps made it more accessible to you? How would I even go about it if I were in this?
Govind, I can tell you it was as alien, maybe a little less alien, because I had visited some fields and farmers during my time at WOTU and Hyperpure. But this divide between India and Bharat was as stark and strong for me as it is for anybody else, right? So I grew up in Delhi. I had never been to a farm, right? The first time I actually probably visited a farm outside of some field trip or some, school trip was when I started working in WOTU. And so, as somebody who was very passionate about food and had started working in that space, you possibly could not avoid, understanding where your food originates from. If you don't have line of sight of that, you're not doing justice to the opportunity at hand. And so it was very natural for me to start really going more upstream and seeing how's food grown, what are the cycles, what are the inputs, outputs. So started applying first principles, like anything else, like any techie would do in any tech-led business. Just that this is also a massive industry, right? There's about I may get the number wrong, but I think there's about 120, 130 million farming households in India, and there's about 400 to 500 million people involved in that livelihood. And so you can just imagine, we're talking about 30-40% of this country's workforce is employed in this sector. And how many successful startups have been built? How much of that ecosystem has benefited from innovation and technology? How many supply chain problems? How many financial inclusion problems? How many farm mechanization problems? Access, information discovery, making things transactional. Like, you can just imagine the number of opportunities that exist. And because it's, this is an ecosystem that we don't usually walk into conveniently, and it's a little bit far flung, most of us, stay away from that. But if any entrepreneur is looking to, solve for the next 500 million people in India and elevate their livelihood and look at how you can be a part of something bigger than, food delivery or delivering something faster or better run campaigns or better marketing platforms. And truth be told, if you speak to 9 out of 10 people, everyone is motivated by doing something larger for society. I think, but how do you gain access to that? There aren't any easy ways. You kind of have to make the effort. And sometimes the best way to do it is to actually pick your car, go out there, speak to a few people, spend some time, right? Start even talking to other entrepreneurs who've made that journey. Start reading up on what are the fundamental areas, issues that these sectors are facing. And I think India and the world, but especially India and the middle income economies in this region, need a lot more innovation and entrepreneurial sort of startups coming in to solve many problems, to really elevate the livelihoods of so many people. And I think that's where the next sort of 500 or 1,000 successful startups can deliver huge impact. And what people don't realize is agriculture today is sitting at a very interesting intersection of not just food, but food, energy, and climate. And rice is a classic example of that. Rice cultivation contributes about 11% of methane emissions globally. Rice is consumed by about 3.5 to 4 billion people on the planet. 80-85% of it is cultivated by smallholding farmers. Rice consumes a third of freshwater resources. It's a $275 billion value chain that is set to double by 2050. The yields are flat to declining. Now you do the math. Can we afford to double the emissions? The answer is no. We can't, cut more forest land and make it available for rice cultivation. So how are you going to feed more people more rice? So food security, climate change, and I spoke about energy. If you look at some of the future high impact, renewable or regenerative energy solutions that are going to be built, they will have to be built using some land resources. So whether it's bio waste, whether it's looking at crops that can be used, whether it's ethanol and so on and so forth. Sustainable aviation fuel is heavily looking at agriculture as a source. These are very significant problems. So agriculture is sitting at the crossroads of these three key focus areas, these three problems to be solved. And I believe successful startups that are able to create business models and design that solve for all three will be around for the next 200-300 years, right? And that's kind of also the focus for me at Rize, that how do we solve for these large macro problems and scale up sustainable solutions for meeting food security, energy security, and the climate crisis.
Oh, makes a lot of sense, and would love to dig in deeper into the mission as well. But even before that, when you look at like Rize.farm, its mission is to reduce methane emissions from rice production and make rice farming more sustainable. How do you monetize that? Right? It's clearly like a really, really powerful mission, and there is a need in the world for that. I'm curious to know what the business model is there. How does a business like this go on to make money?
Yeah, I think there are two types of businesses. One is where you're coming out with an innovative product, right? And it's tech led, and that product in itself is the business, right? In our case, we're actually innovating on the business model itself. It's a business model innovation. And by that, I mean what we're actually doing is we're attempting some social re-engineering. Rice has been cultivated for centuries, right? For a millennia. And what is ailing rice is important to understand. Farmers, follow their traditional practices, cultivation practices. And one of the prominent practices is flooding the fields. Right? And they flood the fields because they feel that when you flood the fields, they're going to prevent weed growth, and that's the best way of cultivating and having a healthy crop. The reality is when you flood the fields, there's a bacteria that starts multiplying and producing methane. It's an anaerobic process. So the tech, if you may, to eliminate that bacteria is simply to let the field dry for 8 to 10 days at the right time. And when you do that, the bacteria dies and you can cut emissions by about 50% or more. The real challenge here is how do you incentivize farmers to change their practice? And this is the social re-engineering, the business model re-engineering. So the focus for us at Rize is how do you introduce the right incentives for farmers to do that, to drive that change in behavior while ensuring that they don't have a yield loss, that they don't lose out in the process, and they actually see an upside. So we provide inputs to the farmers. We finance their inputs for the season. We don't charge them any interest. We typically end up lowering their cost by about 8 to 10%. They also see a slight bump in yield by about 5 to 10%. And so there's a net income improvement of about 20% for the farmers. There's a convenience. They get authentic products. And so we also make money in the process because we buy bulk and we supply direct to farmers. So, but at the heart of this is actually, solving for farmer trust. And to do that, we building micro entrepreneurs from the community who are responsible for 200 to 300 hectares each. And that's how you kind of scale this business.
Interesting. So super interesting. So Rice actually makes money by selling products to farmers as well. But in order to accomplish the mission, there is a larger mission at play. But how Rice makes money is by selling products to the farmers that are actually adopting this new philosophy, this new approach to rice farming.
Yeah, that's kind of it. So, we incentivize lower cost inputs and encourage adoption of sustainable practices. But then to enforce that, we also have our own, digital MRV. So we have built platforms that can do, the carbon credit generation. So we have all the digital trace. We ground truth every hectare that we service. There is monitoring, validation and reporting available through our platform. And so we also earn some revenue through the carbon credits. We work with large carbon buyers who want, high trust credits, and that's another part of the business. Part of that revenue also goes to the farmers. And we're also helping with offtake. So we are connecting large buyers and traders to farmers who are growing sustainably. The idea is that in the world that we live in, nobody's going to pay green premiums. You're not going to buy a rice more expensive because it's sustainable, and nor should you, right? Especially when the technology is there for people to make that shift without spending more, right? So our job is to make sure that sustainably grown rice is available in markets at the same price as high emission rice. And I think that should be a choice that consumers make. It's not something that they should have to, put their hand in their pocket to pay a premium. And so that's the next step that we are working to enable at this point. And I strongly believe that in years to come, we will replace shells in retail stores from, high emission rice to low emission rice and sustainably grown rice.
My question here was, what's the time horizon you give yourself for something like this, right? Social re-engineering sounds like a much harder thing to do than, say, competing on price or just giving consumers an option where they click a button and do something different. So, yeah.
I'm a sucker for pain. This is another.
I was being polite.
Yeah, this is another one of those B2B long play, long trajectory initiatives. Something like this, won't happen in like a 2 to 4 year time frame. You need to kind of give like at least 8 to 10 years for something like this to take hold and really become effective. My hope is that in the next sort of 5 years, we're able to, kind of make the pivots and the fine tunings in the business model, get it to where it needs to be, so that we lock in on something that can then scale, right? And once it's at that point, it should be easily executable. And I go back to Hyperpure. I think that was my mission with Hyperpure as well. Lock in on a business model that's highly predictable. It doesn't matter who's executing after a stage. It'll keep scaling and growing. And honestly, that's kind of the state it's in today. There's obviously new stuff you can keep doing and adding, and there's always innovation opportunities, but the business itself can stand tall on its own 2 feet, right? And I think that's the mark of any successfully designed, run business is go deep, really deep in the first few years, set it up really well, get the foundational work right, and then you're good to go. And so my expectation is it's going to take 4 to 5 years to get Rize to that stage. And also it's, very market sensitive in terms of how governments get involved. A stable crop like rice has various levels of oversight from the ministries, from governments. For example, if I have to meet farmers in Vietnam, I need approvals from the Ministry of Defense in Vietnam, right? Because food security is a matter of national defense in a country like Vietnam. So, you need to kind of jump through various hoops and hurdles, but 5 to 7 years is the minimum horizon for something like this.
Do you think, as someone who's building in the AI space right now, the challenge I see is that there's almost a surfeit of entrepreneurs who have skills, who can tap into businesses that can be built from your doorstep in a 3 to 6 month time frame with enough capital and enough talent. So I often feel like the spaces I explore have hundreds of people trying to go after the very same market. Do you, I guess, intentionally or inadvertently, do you think going after that longer horizon, harder problem or over a slower horizon gives you more of a blue ocean to get there, or is that not even is that not something I should read into?
No, I think that's true. I don't think I did that by design. I think by design people tend to go after what's very current, seems like an interesting bleeding edge technology, and therefore there's a higher propensity to kind of build solutions on ideas or technology trends. I think I've always thought problem first, not solution first. And for me, I've always therefore gravitated towards larger problems and areas of opportunities that will essentially require a longer horizon, right? It doesn't mean we're not using AI. We're actually using AI for a lot of our smaller use cases where if we need to do MRV, can we take images? Can we get AI to detect water levels and things like that? So there's smaller applications, but for me, these are means to an end. And so I've always thought problem first and then solution after.
On a related note, I guess, do you think having the things that you're describing as an end state seem intrinsically socially valuable, right? Which, I mean, I guess to varying degrees aren't the case for all companies out there. The same $100 million of revenue created isn't socially equally valuable. Do you think having that additional mission is something intrinsic to you? Do you think it makes it easier to run a business and align a group of people around it Was it a conscious choice? Is that just how you operate?
I think it's not necessarily a conscious choice. I think it's how every individual is wired. I think, and I won't necessarily say that this is better than something else. I won't say that this is on a higher pedestal. For sure not, right? I think everybody has different motivations. I think there's a huge opportunity for people to work with technology. Technology brings impact in society in a different way. It may not be obvious, but it will probably unleash and unlock a lot of value in different ways, right? For me, I'm wired differently in the sense that I like to look at problem statements that aren't being tackled, that will require a more patient approach and also patient capital. And also therefore I tend to kind of build an ecosystem of people, co-founders, leaders, talent, investors around me that think the same way. And sometimes that may take time, but that's okay too, right? We're in no rush. Larger problems need more persistent thought process and solutioning, and so you will tend to attract people when you put a certain kind of thinking out there.
So you're working on this one problem, but I'm sure you'd come across other problems that you haven't had the time to commit to because you're working on the one that you picked. Do you have any, shall we say, quick fire headers or bullet points of things you think people could explore that you've come across during your search or while talking?
Oh yeah, there's many. I actually have an ideas book that I keep writing down potential ideas that I would love to work and solve. These are opportunities that I wish at some point I will get an opportunity to get a crack at. There's a couple of them I would call out. I feel, as I said, just within the agri space, I think there's a ton of opportunities. So first and foremost, anybody who, and don't go after the obvious low hanging fruits where you do transactional at both ends. I think those are easier and those are sometimes necessary to get started. But I think really go deeper in field and start looking at what are the opportunities there. The other one, I think, looking at eldercare, right? I think that's something that's been spoken about. It's something I've been thinking about probably for 5-7 years now, and we often tend to ignore, or rather we over-index on kind of the younger segment of the population. We kind of focus on people who are easy to target in terms of through Instagram and other social media platforms. But if you think about it, there is a massive segment within India and around the world that is continuously entering, and we will have large senior citizen populations. We're all living lives where we are traveling extensively. We are relocating to different cities for jobs. How do you deal with that as a senior citizen? What is the support system around you? And I see that as a massive opportunities. I have some interesting thoughts and ideas on, people need different kinds of support. People need mental support. People need physical support. People need emotional support. People need medical support. People need financial support and guidance. So there's multiple things that need and should get built out around that whole ecosystem. I think that's a massive opportunity waiting to be cracked in a significant way. And I know there's a few startups starting to look at that space. Also, I think housing and real estate, while it's been done, I don't think it's been done right. And that's another area where I have some ideas that I would love to take a crack at. And if somebody is really passionate and interested about it, happy to speak to them about that as well. So I think these three areas definitely need a lot more work. Climate and sustainability overall is just massive, massive opportunity. It would be remiss on me to not mention that. I think there is a massive urgent need for entrepreneurs to focus on that and don't just look at the popular ones. I think you need to really look far and beyond in terms of, for example, how are cities going to deal with, rising oceans? If I just put that simple statement out there, what's going to happen in that space? Because oceans are rising.
Yeah.
What's going to happen when excessive rainfall takes place? It's happening around us. So I think that if you start really thinking about real world problems, calamities that are happening, climate. So one is, how do you deal with that? One is, how do you arrest it? The other is, how do you reverse it? So if you're really passionate and keen about these spaces, there's a ton of opportunities you can think about there as well.
Thanks for the leads there, Dhruv. One of the things we're doing in the series beyond interviewing folks is digging into specific spaces and picking companies as like the seed point through which we explore that space. We're planning to look at Imoha and the Eldercare space. I chatted with the folks at Wavemaker a while back, and they had a whole list of problems on the climate and sustainability front, and we did want to take each one of them apart and look at what portfolio companies of folks like Wavemaker and beyond have been doing. So maybe we'll reach out to you beyond that, because there's a lot of interesting stuff.
Happy to. Yeah.
Let's actually jump into the rapid fire round, Dhruv. So a few questions. I'm just going to throw that your way. Just throw out the first thing that comes to your mind there. Yeah?
Done.
Okay. If you could go back and give your starting self one piece of advice, what would it be?
I think start sooner. Don't hold back. And if you have something solid that you're thinking and you've come to that conclusion that this is where your passion lies, jump in, right? With the caveat that if you have a certain commitment, you need to find a path. But if you have the ability, don't hold back. Just go for it.
Got it. What's the one book you recommend that every entrepreneur reads, and why?
So this might be an interesting choice. And it's not necessarily just for an entrepreneur, but definitely entrepreneurs as well. I love Ikigai because it kind of talks about a very holistic meaning and approach to life, to well-being, which I think is very important for every entrepreneur, right? Because you will undergo the kind of stress that you've never felt before. And just to give perspective, I think this book is phenomenal.
Got it. What's that one habit that you've adopted that's been a game changer for you?
I think the one thing that I've done consistently over the years, which I give freely that advice to anybody who wants it or doesn't want it, is that zoom in and zoom out. Learn to do that on a daily basis, right? And I think a lot of us do the zoom in pretty well because we're problem solving every day, all the time. But I think we tend not to zoom out as often and take a larger perspective on how we are solving things, not just in the moment, but in our lives. And I think that has always helped me. And I almost relate to it like you're always working on a 10,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, and you're kind of always caught, is this right, is this here? And you end up spending a lot of time. Sometimes all you need to do is zoom back out to 100 feet and see how is it coming together, right? And you can do that yourself. You don't need to get advice. Sometimes just being able to self-reflect is super helpful.
All right. What's been your biggest surprise that you've encountered during your entrepreneurial journey?
I think that has to be like a self-realization of how liberating, the decision to become an entrepreneur is, and how that kind of sets you free, how it helps you evolve as an individual. I think for the longest time while I was, professionally employed, in large corporations, you kind of tend to follow a certain path. Your own thinking doesn't evolve as rapidly, and your worldview is largely operating within the constraints of, how you're going to get your next paycheck, right? Your biggest problems are the politics at work and so on and so forth. And I think all that starts changing very rapidly. And I think for me, that was the biggest surprise, that, how quickly I was evolving as an individual, and maturing through the process of being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, no, totally. Makes a lot of sense. I feel like people who are married, I don't know who said this, but your paycheck is essentially like a drug, right? And the sooner you can actually break out of that entire cycle, then it's truly liberating. So
it's true freedom, right? When you know that you're the one in control, it suddenly sets your senses right where they need to be, right? Otherwise, you're kind of sleepwalking through life for the most part. You're most awake and alive to your senses when that liberation happens.
Yeah, totally. Last question. Is there someone out there that you would love to have as a mentor? And why?
I think I've always, and this may come as a surprise, but I've always admired someone like Ratan Tata. I think it also comes from my early days in TCS. Hugely admired how a very large business was built across multiple industries, solving very large problems in one of the most ethical and respected ways. I think it's not easy. We've all been through different stages of business, and we know how challenging that can be. And I think I would love to have that opportunity to work and be mentored by someone like him. But just reading about him, how he's gone about building and scaling the Tata Group has been phenomenal. So yeah, I think he would be my choice.
Amazing. Love it. Yeah, I think that's it from us. Govind, anything you want to dive into here? But I feel like this was a fantastic podcast. I know I learned a bunch, and I'm sure Govind has as well. Yeah, Dhruv, I'm surprised people don't. We're only hearing a lot of your thoughts now. Almost, I feel like you have a very, very interesting perspective in terms of building businesses and startups and what the entire journey is like.
Yeah, no, thanks for giving me this opportunity, and it was really refreshing for me also to kind of jog my memory back through the different stages and hoops, reliving all the pain points and the high points, and I think that's I would probably end by saying you have one life, give it everything, right, and don't hold back. It is the most fulfilling thing you will do as an entrepreneur. And India needs many entrepreneurs, right? It needs everyone to live their fullest potential and just pick something that you want to make better. That's it.
Lovely.
Yeah.
No, thanks for sharing that, Dhruv. That was, yeah. I mean, we were thinking about bits. I keep thinking about bits that are standalone, because most of the folks who consume content listen to it for 10 seconds and won't necessarily listen to the 1 hour podcast. So I think we will start with this little bit that you just gave us.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think this is super exciting. Thanks for having me on the podcast, guys.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much. All right.
Good stuff.
Yep.
Take care.
See you.
Have a good one.
Have a good one.
You too.
Bye.
You have a good weekend. Bye.
Cool. So, yeah, what do you think, Govind?
That was fun. My immediate thoughts after that was Dhruv was extremely articulate. As people who prepare for podcasts and think about the questions we would ask and how we'd ask them, the interviewee seemed extremely effortless and articulate, which got me thinking, where does that come from, right? It probably comes from a combination of polish and having done this for a while, but I also feel like he had a very strong mental model off of which he was drawing, off of which he was sort of carving slices and cuts of meat, if you'd like, for the as answers to questions we were asking him. So that made the whole experience quite enjoyable. That was my first instinct. What about you?
Yeah, no, definitely very, very articulate. I feel like I don't know how he became so articulate, and I'm curious to know if it was post him being an entrepreneur versus he was always like this because of his business career. I'm inclined to think it's the latter more than anything else, because one of the other things that came out was he actually held very, very senior positions at most other places he worked at, and even at PayPal. And it was really PayPal's loss that they didn't actually move as quickly on going after India as a market, because people like him were just itching to do something else. I also really like the advice that he gave folks, where he tried to be tempered around it, where start sooner, but make sure you take care of your own family finances and all of those kinds of things first. Yeah, I think that's definitely sage advice. So overall, definitely someone I'd love to meet again, bring on board. He threw out a lot of ideas, right, that he feels would be very interesting to go after, like eldercare, or what would happen to coastal cities when the water levels rise and they're likely to get submerged. So each of those things could be things that we could potentially riff with him on.
No, I'd definitely like to get my hands on his idea book, especially if it's literally an idea book. I would love to get a copy of it. Just on that, continuing on that, right? Other things that the kinds of examples he gave us, right? Sustainability, elder care, and so on. A lot of them were rooted in and I asked this question during the interview as well. They were rooted in value to society in addition to sort of money making, which I know you and I have had many conversations about. And increasingly, having spent almost like a decade trying to build businesses, I think having the sort of mission that feels greater than yourself, because this journey gives you a lot of pain, I believe strongly. I've come to believe over the years that having that sort of compass tied to your identity almost allows you to build better, be a better entrepreneur, because there's something more than just the allure of money or the game of playing the business that allows you to push that extra mile when the going gets tough, right? And it's also an easier narrative to get people inspired, because one of the things he mentioned in this, when I asked him the same question in the interview, was that it's not just whether people are purpose driven or not. Everyone wants to do some good. It's just that over the years, humans have learned to sort of diverge what we do for a living from what we want to achieve in terms of like the things we leave behind for society. So maybe I'm reading a little too much into it, but I found the mission-driven aspect of almost all of his answers and his ideas to be quite something.
See, I was definitely inspired, right? He'd be definitely someone that I would love to work with, even like work for, right? Because of that mission aspect to it. I'm still not completely sold on whether you need to have like a deep mission that you're so passionate about to actually end up starting a business. It's just something that I don't necessarily think it's a must. I feel like there are a lot of businesses out there that become really, really successful without really having that, or without the founders really having that. They may portray that they have it, but I don't think they actually have it. And I think there's a healthy balance to keep, because I also know of a lot of founders who just talk about the mission and don't ever end up building out a business model. Dhruv was definitely not that, but I do meet plenty of people like that, and I'm just like, man, I'm just too old to drink the Kool-Aid that you're selling right now. So yeah, so maybe something we can dig into another time, I guess.
This feels like a dedicated podcast. More to dig.
Yeah, I agree. Let's talk about what were the key takeaways that you got from Dhruv as far as business is concerned, right? And his business philosophy. What were your takeaways over there?
Yeah, two very distinctive things stand out. For me, point number one was he went after ideas that were not contrarian. B2B in India is even now something that you'd ask questions about or take a second look at. And especially in 2014, I'm sure you would have felt the same way. So picking things that are contrarian and then betting on a 5 to 10 year horizon, I think it puts you in an interesting spot, because you may have to category create. Perhaps it's a certain kind of business that you'll end up creating as a result. You may have to category create. You may have to sort of trailblaze, but you may have lesser competition as well. And by doing harder things, you have fewer fly-by-night folks who are fly-by-night competitors who can come in and like cut you on cost or just be in the market right next to you. It's more you in the market, which to me, at least as someone who's always competed like in what feels like a red ocean, that felt very interesting. And then the flip side, the second point I was trying to make is almost related to this, which is we keep asking the question, you asked this question, what is the moat of a business, right? And when we think of moats, especially in this sort of a red ocean mindset that all of us have, I think we think of moats as like distribution advantages, cost advantages, and just very like tangible things where you're like, hey, what if a better capitalized company comes in and undercuts your prices and so on? Then he spoke about human relationships, which are hard to manufacture. It's hard to throw money at it. It's something that takes time to build, which I thought was super interesting, because those are not the terms in which, that's not what we usually go to when we define the value of a business, right? We don't say their relationships are great. The closest we get to is to say that their brand is strong, which is a form of like one directional relationship. But that felt quite novel to me in terms of improving my mental model.
Yeah. I have a follow-up question over there. I totally buy into the idea that business relationships are important in B2B. That's sort of what gets people to buy. You're buying from people you know. Cultivating the relationship is really important. Even in my business, we end up really investing very heavily on a customer success team and trying to make sure that we come across as a extension of our customers' teams and so on. But let's say in this particular case, right? Okay, you're building a really, really close relationship with restaurant owners who are actually buying from you and you're the vendor of choice. If another competitor was to come along, right, and offer lower prices or offer better credit terms or payment terms and so on, how strong would you be willing to hold on to your relationships? I guess what would really happen there is you probably give a heads up to the person you have a good relationship with, being like, hey, here's someone who actually came around. Very, very compelling offer. I'm tempted. Is there something you can at least do for me? Versus actually just switch directly, right? So yeah, I feel like relationships are important, but I do feel like sometimes businesses, you just have to make hard decisions. But yeah, B2B sales is a lot about relationship building. But yeah.
I think for risk of reading too much into this, I think there's a larger point. This is true in macroeconomics as well in general, where whenever you bottle anything in economics, you assume that every player is an economically rational individual, which is that if someone's paying us, if one person pays me 100 rupees, another one pays me 101 rupees, I'm going to go with the guy who pays me 101 rupees. But a lot of economical models break down because that is proven to be not how humans operate. Couple of quick examples, right? Number one, you and I have been in this situation. Even if we know that someone needs to be fired, and if you ask ourselves the question, would you hire this person today, knowing what you know right now? And the answer is no. It still takes a lot to go ahead and fire that person, right? Unless you are like the most ruthless, most experienced entrepreneur. So when it comes to people, I think hiring and firing, it's easier with like a business relationship and a vendor relationship, but like employee relationships is something that we encounter this a lot in, right? Similarly, it's been proven that when costs drop, the last cost that a business cuts is salaries, right? It's the same version of firing, except you're like repricing a good. And human beings are just socially not built to kill these things. I hear what you're saying, and you probably cannot. There's probably a dollar value to this, right? It's not 1 cent. The better the relationship, the activation threshold for churning may be a bit higher.
No, but I agree. I totally do agree, though, that B2B businesses' early sales happens through relationships, and companies that really invest in that will end up succeeding, right, over a longer term horizon. Let's jump into some of the businesses that Dhruv actually helped start and is running. What do you think about Hyperpure?
I'm going to flip this one back on you because I know you did a lot more research on this going in. So I love your take. Knowing what I know, the things he pointed out was better relationships, pick a niche. He said a bunch of interesting things about protein, which I didn't anticipate, but I'm summarizing here. Why don't you go first? Because you might have a better sense.
Yeah. So I actually was like digging into Hyperpure for a while just to sort of understand a little bit more about the business more than anything else. I'm just curious. I hear a whole bunch of people talking about how Hyperpure is a dark horse for Zomato and so on, and creating a lot of hype around it. But see, numbers don't lie. The business is making 617 crores as of the last earnings report, right? Which is around $80 million, which is a sizable business. And there are clearly a lot of synergies for Zomato, where Zomato is actually already selling a bunch of different products to restaurants. They're the delivery partner for restaurants and so on and so forth. So the distribution channel is almost like very clear to them. And for Zomato per se, I actually feel like this is potentially a very good business. And one of the things that, reading between the lines over here, the business that Dhruv tried to start in terms of WOTU, which he eventually, I don't want to say tried to start, he started and sold to Hyperpure. I feel like he had a lot of trouble raising capital at that time because it was so heavy in CapEx, right? You needed to end up building out the warehouses and so on, which was something that a lot of venture dollars weren't really going into back then. But Zomato clearly saw the need over there and they were willing to put in capital there. So props to them for that. The other interesting thing that came up both in this conversation and through my reading is that Zomato is trying to like backward integrate further, get into contract farming with farmers itself. So they're able to provide predictability to farmers. They're able to actually end up like getting goods that they can end up then distributing at a much lower cost. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point Zomato decides to end up creating their own private labels and so on and so forth as well around this. So overall, I think it's a really good business for Zomato. But that being said, though, I actually don't think there are as many moats as... I actually don't think the moats are really insurmountable here. And the reason why I say that is, let's go back to what Dhruv said, right? When he was actually speaking to all these restaurants and chefs and so on, the interesting insight that he got was this entire industry is governed by the protein supply chain. If that still holds true even now, I almost feel like companies like, let's say, Licious or Captain Fresh or any of these other B2C vendors that deal with the sale of fish and other meats and so on and so forth can easily start selling to hotels and other restaurant partners, which is where, like, relationships and things like that make a huge difference. But that being said, though, let's think about, like, the one thing that these vendors would have figured out already is the supply chain side of things. And they would be able to get really, really good rates on that side of things. And now they just need to end up like focusing that supply chain on a completely different market, right? Which is, I don't want to trivialize it, but that's definitely possible. And the other part of the business that I think about, and this is something that Dhruv himself sort of mentioned, right? Where if someone was to create a competitive Hyperpure, he'd almost take like a very community first approach to it. He'd end up being like, hey, let's actually get a chef. Let's actually end up like co-creating different recipes. I'd almost take it a step further where let's focus on like a particular niche. Let's focus on Pan-Asian restaurants in Kormangla, right? I'd keep it even as specific as that. And then get all the chefs together, figure out recipes, figure out like things, try and build community around there, make it really fun and interesting for them. And along the way, become the vendor of choice for several of their products and really crack this one particular niche before actually expanding to other niches as well. So that's sort of how I would actually go after it. If I wanted to build a business that I wanted to eventually sell to Zomato, what I would end up doing is like, hey, let me actually go to a place where Hyperpure doesn't exist and let me do exactly what Hyperpure is doing in, let's say, Kochi or Coimbatore or wherever, and build a nice, sizable business. And then eventually get it to a point where I'm like, okay, I have all these restaurants and hotels and caterers all buying from me. Sell it again to a business like Hyperpure. It actually doesn't seem too difficult and too far-fetched to do something like that. So for someone who wants to do something very small and niche, this is definitely an opportunity in my mind.
Interesting. You broke it down by, my takeaways as you break it down by geography, you break it down by delicacy type, you break it down by groups of communities. As you're saying that, I also wonder if, we've been talking about the actual goods that flow through these pipes, whether it be Licious or whether it be Hyperpure as commodities. I wonder if there are, for certain niches, whether there are captive supply chains, right? Like, so I'm a vegan, so I don't know what a good analogy here is, but let's say you're selling to a seafood restaurant. I wonder if there's a certain kind of fish that only certain restaurants sell, and all of a sudden there's a narrow supply for that, and you are captive over that and sign contracts, and people necessarily have to come to you because there's nowhere else to get it. I wonder if over time you can start differentiating even on the supply side, even though the bulk would be carrots and tomatoes. It's often the catalog, basket, and availability that brings people in, which has been the strategy of folks like on the B2C side, Amazon, and so on and so forth. So feels like there are interesting ways in which starting from a niche as well, a business can counter-position. Oh, it's not counter-position, but position itself against an existing.
Yeah, totally. But no, all things said though, I do think this is definitely a valuable business for Zomato. And I mean, props to them for actually doing this and going after it. I just don't think, unlike, let's say, if I wanted to build another restaurant discovery business, I almost wouldn't even try, or a B2B vendor for restaurants. That's something I could potentially see many players actually winning in this market. So it's just about figuring out your edge more than anything else. What do you think about Rize.farm and Nurture.farm and so on? Like the next arc of Dhruv's career where he started focusing more on like agri-tech more than anything else.
Yeah. As software people, as SaaS AI folks, I think this is quite far from our day job, so hard to like have a strong instinctive opinion on it. I mean, narrative-wise, it seems very thematic, given what he's done with in terms of moving up the supply chain, in terms of the supply chain he was working with at WOTU. He worked at Nurture.farm, so feels like he might have built some prior experience there. and C, of course, he's looking at like larger problems which can be of benefit to society in addition to making money. So I think all the narrative there fits. One interesting anecdote as an aside before I get to further thoughts on this. I had spent some time prior to starting my current startup with Wavemaker, which I believe is one of his investors. This is a VC that has a larger goal of sustainability and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and things like that. And I hope I'm doing justice to what they do. But they also do a lot of research on such topics to understand where monetary opportunities exist and how greenhouse gases can be reduced. And I remember having a chat a couple of years ago with them about this very same idea. Personally, I walked away from it because I knew nothing about farming in Southeast Asia. And I was still excited about software and AI, and I still am. So personally, I would find this very hard to adapt to. It feels like a hard problem, so I'm sure there's lesser competition. He talked about social engineering being one of the prime, shall we say, bottlenecks for the business, which seems like an incredibly hard thing to do, because I know how hard it is to convince my, parents about something that I believe to be absolute truth, never mind someone completely different. And I imagine there are objective measures, right? Like better cultivation, higher yield, things like that. So it seems incredibly hard. But once you've captured something like that, I imagine there are many ways to monetize it. I think you brought up financing, which often lands up being the way you make money here. So I know I'm not being very specific, but feels like it's extremely hard. There's a lot of money that goes into it. Macro from like a 200, 300 year journey. That's what another thing we can perhaps reflect on, which is that was his ambition, to build a business that would last 200 to 300 years. So from that perspective, it definitely seems more interesting than starting, say, yet another CRM and things like that could yield more money. But yeah, I for one would be interested in seeing where this goes. Perhaps 10 years down the line, I'm sure they're not going to be like crazy results in a year or two, which would be fun to keep an eye on nonetheless.
So
what about you?
Yeah, I was looking this up while you were speaking. So the global rice market, it is 290-ish billion right now, and it's projected to go to 334 billion by 2030. So it's definitely a large enough market. And I sort of seen what he's talking about, where you just sort of flood the fields when it's time to actually grow the rice. And he sort of dug into about how that's actually very wasteful and doesn't actually lead to higher rice yields. So he kind of needs to, he used the word social engineering, and needs to change how people have been doing something for decades and centuries, which, as you said, isn't going to be that easy. But if he manages to do it, right, it seems like a win-win for everyone, right? Farmers are going to need to spend less money, right? Rice is going to grow a lot more sustainably, right? It's better for the planet. And one of the other key things that he spoke about was like, he wants rice that's there on the shelves for consumers to buy, or sustainably grown rice, to be just as cheap or expensive. It shouldn't cost any different than other kinds of rice, right? Because everyone wants to do good in the world, but nobody wants to pay money, right? To actually necessarily do it, or not as many people would do that. So another interesting insight over there. Yeah, I can't comment more than that. I'm just curious to know, like, how would a business like this make money right now? So you mentioned financing. Could you like dig into it a little bit more in terms of how would you assume that Rize.farm is making money right now? And what are the different ways by which they could make money in the future?
Yeah, I'm just guessing here on the financing bit. But folks, I'm reading into what he said. My interpretation is that farmers, like any business, I guess you invest, in this case with seeds and water and so on, and you yield and you make money when you go ahead and sell the end product, which is rice. So there is a cash flow cycle there, and there's an investment upfront and so on. So especially if you need to make changes, you probably need to borrow money. And if these folks are there in the process to offer loans to farmers or to help create the supply chain for all the middlemen in the process, and if this actually lands up working and succeeding, then they have suddenly become the financiers of the newer supply chain. And build good relationships in the process, which again is important from a money payback perspective. So I imagine that's one way they're looking at it. But more broadly as well, I wonder if social reengineering doesn't work. There are other interesting things they could do, right? If this is actually true, we've talked about B2B and then just being the business itself. You and I keep talking about selling to hospitals versus building a hospital. So in this case, I wonder if they could also just go down the route of, look, raising capital and then building farms, proving that you have higher yield, and then working backwards and then showing people in the community how it happens from there. So there seems like many ways in which they could approach this problem. They probably can't buy the country of Vietnam and then replace it. Yeah. But it feels like there are many things here.
Yeah.
Is that convincing enough?
I just think it's a very, very hard business, right? But these are the kinds of businesses that will be very valuable down the line. Props to him for doing it. I keep wondering whether I would do something like this, and I'm just not sure. But one of the threads I wanted to explore from what you said, right, is I feel like an opportunity over here is to create a D2C rice brand called Rize.farm or whatever it is, put it on the shelves, generate some demand, generate awareness around sustainably grown rice, and then essentially be the supplier for a lot of these other rice distributors as well. Because I really feel like unless existing players also feel like, hey, they're missing out on a bigger trend and some of their market share is actually going away, things wouldn't actually end up changing, right? So that's something that I feel like could be worth exploring. And I know it's a brand new company. They probably haven't gotten to this yet, but let's see. Next time we meet Dhruv, maybe we can ask him about that.
The way I look at this is we have organic. If you open up Big Basket or Zepto nowadays, right, you'll see organic rice and you'll see traditional rice. And normally the gap, if I'm not mistaken, is about 20-30%. And the people who click on organic are people like us, tier 1 premium India or tier 1 premium populations in at least in poorer countries. I wonder if for a market, I get what you're saying, right? We all think of we all know the Tesla story where you go top of the line and then you work downwards. But you're literally talking about something that everybody needs. That is a commodity. Everyone's buying rice, and the market is so large that I wonder if it is still legitimate to lower prices and make money. Increase yield or lower costs and make money on the margin because the market's large, right? Unlike a new category creation, unlike the creation of a new category where you want to expand the value of your good, you want to increase the MRP and then make money on that difference and then work downwards. Here, I think the demand is ready. Like it's literally rice. I'm jealous about the B2B2C model here where the demand from the sea side is almost guaranteed because you can be quite sure that people are going to eat like staple food 30 years down the line. So, yeah.
Yeah, I loved it overall. And hopefully our audience as well.
Yeah, looking forward to more such conversations. And that's a wrap on our first interview. If you liked what you just heard, please like, share, and subscribe. This is Weekend Entrepreneurs, a series in which we dig into interesting businesses in India with the goal of creating many more entrepreneurs for the country and beyond.